Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about how Terastalization feels now that we've had the chance to play with it and against it. So before, in theory, I and a lot of others were quite concerned about the offensive implications of Terastalization. Now, while Terra types are still rather difficult to come by, requiring significant grinding for a single Pokemon, people are putting the time in and getting their Terra Pokemon for online battles, and I have faced many of them. I can say this, yes, same type Terra boosted attacks are an option, but so far, it really hasn't felt like that big of a deal. What is a big deal is the defensive potential for Terastalization. I was completely unprepared for how big of a difference this can actually make. On top of everything you have to deal with in a Pokemon battle, particularly at the beginning of a format where there are new moves, Pokemon, abilities, and items to learn, we have this new mechanic. This mechanic which can seriously turn an easy win into an impossible loss. On one hand, I like this, as it's kind of a reward for foresight in the team building process. On the other hand, this mechanic is extremely unpleasant to play with in my experience so far. Sure, using it correctly and being rewarded feels good. Dodging a Thunderbolt into your Gyarados by Terastalizing into the ground type is great. However, on the other end of course, it feels really bad. Pokemon are generally balanced around their weaknesses. Pokemon like Gyarados, for instance, has great stats, great abilities, and learns a lot of good moves. Its typing is also rather good, with one catch, being 4 times weak to electric type moves. Now, the strength of this mechanic doesn't lie entirely in the ability to flip weaknesses into immunities. It's the whole package. Changing your type not only changes your weaknesses, but in changing to a single type, the odds are that you will be taking neutral damage or better from whatever your opponent is preparing to do. So in Terastalizing, you are essentially gaining the defensive benefits of Dynamax or better by changing types. The ability to change types like this means we really need to reconsider how we build teams and choose which Pokemon to bring into a match. Previously, you could look at teams like this using this team that I built and say, okay, Tyranitar, Bronzong, Houndstone, Garchomp, Gyarados, and Pincurchin. How do I beat this team? Well, we have 4 offensive-focused Pokemon on this team, 2 of them with choice items, which we will need to take into consideration. Gholdengo primarily hits for Steel and Ghost-type damage. Steel only hits 3 of the 6 for good damage. Ghost can hit the other 3, so no matter which Pokemon are led, I will have at least good damage here, but not necessarily sweeping power, as we will lock into a single move. Gyarados only has Water and Ground-type coverage, so it can deal some decent damage to 4 of them, but we will need to be careful with Gyarados and Houndstone with their Will-O-Wisp and Intimidate. Volcarona has Fire and Grass type coverage, which allows us to hit everything for at least neutral damage, and Tsareena primarily has Grass, Fighting, and Fairy coverage, which allows us to do a lot of damage, but again, we need to be careful with Burn and Intimidate. So perhaps lead off with Gholdengo and Murkrow, as we will avoid Intimidate, Burn, and threaten a lot of offensive pressure immediately without having to worry about anything else. They lead off with Tyranitar and Bronzong, so naturally I'm thinking a couple of things. Number 1, if Bronzong sets up Trick Room, Tyranitar can't be quashed due to being a dark type, and can threaten huge damage onto 3 of my 4 offensive Pokemon. With Tyranitar protecting being highly likely, attacking Bronzong here makes sense. Alternatively, Tyranitar currently threatens high damage into Gholdengo, so if they think that I will attack Bronzong, they could just attack with Tyranitar. So what to do? The problem is, it might not even matter what I decide. Terastalization can effectively make either of these choices, either killing the Tyranitar or killing the Bronzong, a non-option. If Bronzong changes type into the normal type, Shadow Ball does nothing. Trick Room goes up, and I almost certainly lose the battle. If Tyranitar changes type into, say, Ghost type or something, Steel becomes neutral, and with Tyranitar's high base stats, almost certainly lives and retaliates. Trick Room likely goes up, and we almost certainly lose even still. So is there a way around this? Sort of, yes. The way around this is simply to play Pokemon differently. Otherwise, you will be playing game after game relying heavily upon reads or luck to prevail, as your opponent could have any Terra type on their Pokemon and opt to Terastalize at any time, potentially turning the battle on its head in a way you can't really prepare for. So what is this change you can make? The change is to play and build defensively. Additionally, the more common your Pokemon are, the more likely people will know what is coming and can choose what and when to Terastalize accordingly. This is potentially where Terastalization could come into play with Tera Blast. I think more defensive and positional playstyles are going to become significantly more common in the coming weeks as people begin understanding that, contrary to what many of us thought, we aren't going into a hyper offensive meta. If anything, we're going into a hyper defensive meta. A timely Terastalization into the right Tera type has extreme swing potential, so much so that playing offensively just doesn't seem to be a reliable strategy. Currently, with a more offensive team, I'm still winning the vast majority of games even without any Tera types differing from my base types. However, certain teams I've run up against which make good use of Terastalization turned the game around in a single turn, leaving my team in shambles. When playing matches, we will constantly need to be aware that in any moment our opponent could opt to Terastalize. We can predict which types it might be so far as which types make sense based on their weaknesses, but attempting to call a Terastalization, for example firing a Shadow Ball into a Tyranitar expecting it to Terastalize, could have absolutely horrendous consequences if your opponent doesn't end up Terastalizing. So how are we supposed to attack if at any time our opponents could completely reverse everything? It's honestly a really tricky question, and I'm not sure I have the answer just yet, particularly when dealing with Pokemon with setup potential like Trick Room or Tailwind, or boosting moves like Nasty Plot or Swords Dance. The consequences of playing too passively can be equally as devastating as attacking into a resist only to be counterattacked for significant damage. For me, I think instead of thinking in terms of what coverage moves I need to get through my opponent's team based on their types, I will instead look at my opponent's team and determine what coverage moves they gain access to, then use Pokemon which can resist most of these attacks while still doing good damage in return. Your opponent has the option to Terastalize for coverage and use Tera Blast, but that is only a single Pokemon, which is much easier to deal with as Tera Blast is base 80 power and can be defensively pivoted around. Using defensive tactics allows you to essentially ignore the trap of Terastalization by not putting yourself into a vulnerable position in the first place. All you have to do is ensure your opponent doesn't boost their offensive capabilities beyond what your team can handle defensively. Have options to deny setup Pokemon, and I expect you will prevail more times than not. If I were going into a tournament right now, you'd better believe I'd be using a defensive team. I expect in a best 2 out of 3 format, Terastalization will be a much healthier mechanic, as perhaps you lose game 1 to the Terastalization surprise factor, but at least you know about it going into game 2 and can adapt accordingly. For those of you that would like to try my team, here is the rental code for it. It's worth noting that both Pachirisu and Gyarados do not have their hidden abilities, which would be more optimal. Additionally, I have not had the time to grind for Tera Shards, so I'm afraid the Tera types are generic. Nevertheless, there are some really cool Pokemon on this team, like Gholdengo, which may be my favorite Pokemon of this generation, and Murkrow, one of my favorite all-time VGC Pokemon, so I encourage you to give it a try. Well, that's going to be it for this video. Let me know what you think about Terastalization down in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this, and I'll see you in the next one.